Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSPmagazine. Every company has a story to tell, from the small startup to the large enterprise, and everything in between. This is one of them. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Boo.
Who you gonna call?
Who are you gonna call? Not me, that's for sure.
No, you're gonna call the professionals.
That's right. We're gonna call the professionals to deal with the ghosts that are lingering. 10 years of ghosts have been around, Marco.
10 years? I think there's
Probably
been
longer.
more than 10 years. 10 years is when some company that we're going to name really soon started to create some reports. So if they decided to create a report 10 years ago, I'm pretty sure it's been a few years before than that this was already a pesky problem. Let's call it that. Pesky problem, which is not ghosts, though.
Not ghosts, no.
What is
no,
a
the
show?
ghosts? The ghosts are one type of these things, but let's just say that the traffic on the internet is not always driven by humans. There's a lot driven by bots, and which are basically little bits of machine code that act on our behalf or do things so we don't have to. And a lot of it's for good purposes. Customer support, probably a good example of that, where you interact with something to find something out, to not waste somebody's personal physical time as a human. But a lot of that stuff can be used nefariously because at the end of the day, we're not ghosts. We are humans, and humans do weird things. And so a lot of the traffic we see on the internet is not always human and not always good. And our good friends at Imperva have been following this trend, as we noted, for 10 years or longer, and have produced a report on this. And I mean, a decade of following these bots to see what's happening. There's a lot. And I'm very, very interested and excited to have this conversation and kind of take a look back at 10 years, how things have changed over time and where we kind of sit. And of course, Marco, you won't rest without us going into the future. So we'll have a peek there too.
For sure.
That's probably enough from me talking. The real star of this show is Karl Triebes. Karl, how are you?
I'm doing great. Hey guys, thanks for having me on today.
Of course.
This is going to be fun. And Karl, a few words about, before we get started, a few words about your role at Imperva and some of the things you do there. I presume a lot of it is bot oriented, but what else goes on there?
Yeah, so I'm the general manager here for the AppSec business unit at Imperva, and we focus exclusively on application security when I talk about AppSec. And what that means is bots are absolutely a critical component of that, but we also protect APIs, for example. We protect your web applications. We protect your networks, against DDoS attacks and other types of malicious behaviors. We protect DNSSEC, and we've done this. That's basically the history of the company. It's a pure play security company, very much focused on application security, and so that's what we do day in and day out. And the bots are critical to that because they act as a delivery mechanism for a lot of these malicious or these attacks. And they do it by, essentially emulating valid humans, right? What they're trying to do is look like a human, but do bad things behind the scenes. And that's really, why you got to watch these bots, and they can do it at speed in very sophisticated ways.
Yeah, and there is a reason, I guess, why the report is not called the bot report, but it's called the bad bot report, because that's unfortunately where we have to focus. But I always like to have this conversation, and if I'm wrong, this is at least the fourth time that we talk about these reports in the past years. And so we have a clear idea, at least Sean and myself are prepared to this, but there may be some new listener in the audience that are not so prepared. So maybe it would be good to start, as Sean said, I'd like to ask a futuristic question, but you got to start from the past. So how do we get to where we are now? And I have to say, you mentioned before we start recording, this year seems like it's the interest for this report is even bigger. So it's not a fad that is going away, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're just seeing this problem grow over time, and we've been doing this for 10 years, like you said. We get a really good response every year. A lot of, we provide a lot of interesting data. We try not to, we don't focus on, our product or anything like that. We're actually just producing what we see out there based upon our analytics and what we see both through we provide a big SaaS service. And so we see a lot of things in that. We have other mechanisms for going out and doing searching through our, for these different types of bots through our threat research team. And like we said, is that we just see it continue to grow. And this year in particular, I think it just seems to have hit a nerve, or maybe we hit kind of some critical point, because it is definitely a much bigger, in terms of the interest, the amount of feedback that we've seen on this report this year, and specifically has been a much bigger year than previous years, is the way I'd characterize it.
And I'm guessing AI, that you're going to talk about that later.
Absolutely. AI is on top of everybody's minds today, in various ways. And absolutely, that's, we actually leverage AI and other mechanisms, machine learning, have done it for years to help detect and do these things. But now, with basically like Hugging Face and ChatGPT and all that, they're democratizing, the access to AI, which means the barriers to entry to do sophisticated things quickly and easily is dropping rapidly, right? And so that's what you got to be aware of. It's because that will change the attack profiles and the types of attacks we see. So I expect next year's report to be very inclusive of a lot of new style of attacks based upon that.
Yeah, when Marco and I can get our hands on AI and ChatGPT type stuff, we're in a world of trouble. But
yeah.
But on a serious note, let's look back, because and maybe connect it to kind of the history or some of the trends throughout the years in the report as well. What's changed from? Well, let's just focus on the business environment infrastructure. I can point to a couple things to kind of give you an idea where I'm headed with this. The number of homegrown applications within an organization, how has that changed? With that, APIs, cloud, and I'll leave it to you to kind of paint the full picture here, but those are kind of some of the things that I'm thinking of. How have things shifted in 10 years that, and here's the kicker, that have enabled bots to succeed and grow over time as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that have happened. Yeah, and I think what you're pointing out a lot is the attack surface has changed significantly in the last 10 years, because in the past, especially enterprise, kind of the classic enterprise IT application was built fairly monolithic. You would have a team that would put together a stack, and it would run in its whole, on either servers within the data center, or it could be running like on a cloud server. But the application itself was this very monolithic app where the OS was built in, and everything kind of happened within this stack, and any modifications was in this stack. In the last 10 years, apps have become distributed. And what that means is these monoliths have been broken up. And they do that because, one, you want to have scalability. Two, you want to break it up to allow it to run in different types of infrastructure, flexibly. And so those are some of the big changes. The other changes with that as well has been how the applications are put together. Open source specifically, there's been an explosion in the use of open source in the last 10 years. Just go on to the various GitHub repositories out there, and the open source project du jour. And these things get leveraged in many different ways. So, for example, you could be building an app, you need a database, you may go to Amazon, leverage one of their databases, but maybe you're doing a self-managed version of Kafka and tying that in. So there's some open source you're having to manage, and you've opened up your attack surface because now you have something that's not being controlled by you, that there could be code defects and other kind of vulnerabilities that hackers can take advantage of. Good examples of that would be the Log4Shell vulnerability that came out, over about a year and a half ago in Java. And so Java applications that were unprotected or unpatched were susceptible to that. So with that landscape of changes, with the types of components that come together, how they're being distributed, and then on top of that, now becoming API driven, because not all automation is bad automation. In fact, there's many cases for good automation, like business to business systems, inventory management. There's all sorts of applications where you want to be able to share and freely exchange data in an automated way. And APIs absolutely support that. But because they're open and developed by developers, and I'm a developer by trade, that a lot of times they're focused on, how do they get the business logic in versus how do they protect the business logic? They're not security experts. And so all these things conspire to kind of create this landscape or this vulnerability landscape that just broadens that attack surface for these different, bad bots, if you will.
So we know that the battle of good versus evil is never ending, and we're not hoping to resolve cybersecurity issues problem in one conversation, or in 1,500 like we have done on ITSP magazine. But we also know that this battle goes on, and so as you mentioned, a lot of different way that the bad guys have been working with the new technology. I'm also assuming that there are some advantage in using AI or other advanced technology, and we're fighting that battle in a different way than what we were doing maybe 10 years ago. So can you tell us a little bit about what has been the evolution on the good guys side?
Yeah, I mean, it is an arms race, like you said. Being able to keep up with these different exploits or try to stay ahead of them. I would say that the pervasive feature the last 10 years has been the sophistication of the bots and how they've increased. Back in 2014, we first started seeing, the use of kind of mobile browsers and things like that to emulate, users. And then what we saw then the following year was this explosion, like an 11% increase in sophistication. So they're now using these kind of mobile browsers, and then they're coming in and being much more evasive. So they would start rotating IP addresses and things like that, or coming through different proxies, or they start emulating human behaviors. They can try to emulate how a mouse might move and things like that. And the whole idea there is to obfuscate the fact that they're automated bots, and that's continuing. That is the one feature that we see for sure. The sophistication just keeps going up. And what we see now is part of that is that sophistication is now they're trying to take it, and this is especially true of API security. So like last year, for example, 17% of attacks against APIs were what we call business logic attacks, and this is by bots. And what that meant is they go in and they surveil the application. They look at, basically the endpoints, or they go and look and see what are the parameters, and they try to inject information, see what comes back, and take advantage of that. And eventually they'd map out the entire application, find vulnerabilities, and they either do things like account takeover, inject malicious code, things like that. And that's a big vector for attack, because your application logic, your business logic tends to be very complex and broad, and it's changing all the time. So it's really hard to necessarily for developers to kind of stay on top of that, ensure that they're not opening up vulnerabilities or exploits. I mean, look at any source, open source project. These are big developer, centric, solutions, and they're changing all the time. And you're always just seeing tons of vulnerabilities as a result of that. So it's no different when you're in-house. And just imagine now multiplying your problem by all this open source that you're leveraging in there, and then stitching it together with vulnerable APIs. So it creates that big attack surface. And so what that means now is you try to defend against these malicious users by saying, I'm going to do behavioral analysis. I'm going to watch and see what they're doing, and over time observe this, and then based on that block that. Well, as AI, we're talking about this, as AI becomes more sophisticated and the use of it becomes more sophisticated, it's going to be much harder to detect a valid user from an invalid user, because they're just going to get much better at emulating human behaviors. Things like CAPTCHAs. Today CAPTCHA is kind of a way to slow down hackers, right? You go and throw the CAPTCHA up, and you assume a human can get at it. It's the only one that can solve that. Well, that's going to change. You already have CAPTCHA farms now. Those are going to kind of go away, because anybody using AI will be able to start to evade, using behavioral mechanisms. And so what that means now is that you have to look at your toolkit differently. Here we do things like we do client-side injections. We actually look at the client, try to figure out, based on what it is, how it responds to specific messages or things we send down to it, its history, previously fingerprint, things like that. And that way it helps us, set some credibility, understand what it's doing. We use other mechanisms like looking at low-level transactions between memory and CPU space and seeing if they're accessing invalid parts of the memory or doing things they shouldn't be. That's with our RAS products. So my belief is you gotta kind of go towards the client. You got to kind of go towards down in the stack. And these are the mechanisms that are going to become much more effective in detecting these AI-induced attacks, or they'll be part of that toolkit, I guess is the way to say it. Oh, I hope that makes sense. I know I'm kind of going over a bunch of stuff here, but hopefully
it certainly does. And I mean, your point on the CAPTCHA is only good if you're trying to enter through the CAPTCHA. But if you know the logic and can go around the CAPTCHA or through an API that doesn't interact with the CAPTCHA, the CAPTCHA doesn't matter anyway. And then if it does get encountered, like to your point, there are many tools and technologies to kind of help you get through that from a bot perspective too. So I want to look at this from a sector perspective, because over 10 years, a lot of the new technology may have and customizations and growth and scale and things like that may have been focused or only absorbed and used by certain industries. And I think it's probably used by every industry now. Some of the things I mentioned earlier, right? They're homegrown apps and use of the cloud and things like that. And certainly with that, the use of open source and APIs and whatnot. So how have the sectors changed in terms of bot activity? Are there any particular sectors that continue to be prime targets? Are there other new ones that have been targets? Are they targets, or is it a matter of just the nets being tossed and those fish now are in this sea that they weren't before? Kind of paint that picture for us, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, it has changed a bit. I mean, the number one place to go attack is the financial services industry, banks and others. Account takeover attacks, carding scams, things like that, because those have real money sitting behind them. Like a carding scam, if you can take like a gift card or a credit card and you can just start pumping numbers in there until you get a hit, then that's cash basically that's gone. And so those are you see a lot of those. There's others. I'd say one of the bigger ones now is like on either e-commerce side, because of the explosion of e-commerce, and especially over the during the close downs with COVID, that's really exploded. And so everything from, like I mentioned earlier, these Grinch bot attacks, where they were buying like gaming consoles at Christmas time and then reselling those for like 4 times the price. They do that like a lot of times for like events, tickets, and things like that. But you also see, like within the leisure and travel industry, a lot going on there with web scraping, would you say, or scraping for like pricing information. So if you get your competitors' pricing and you can get that, then you can adjust your pricing and do that. And so there's things like that go on in a number of areas. So one of the big ones we saw last year, and this actually wound up being more about DDoS style attacks, was geopolitical. When geopolitical strife is hit, we'd see like a lot of attacks like on government sites. You can imagine the countries where some of this was happening, especially back at the start of the Ukraine, Russia conflict. But you saw it in other parts of the world when there's other, issues, and other things where they'd come in, attack government websites, shut down services, and do things like that. So you're seeing more of the kind of things happening based on politics or political events or world events, geopolitical events, I should say.
So what are some of the most, and I don't know if they're called payloads, with the outcomes of these malicious acts performed by bots? You mentioned DDoS as one example, scraping of prices is another. Can you kind of give us a picture of what some of those common ones are, and if there have been any significant changes in the last 10 years or even just last year with some of those?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big ones is account takeover attacks, because what attackers will tend to do is you have these data breaches, and then they'll sell that breached material online to these attackers, and then what they do is they buy it, and then basically they just keep trying different sites and just sequencing through these credentials or these credit cards or whatever this data they have, and then in hopes to get a hit. And that's one profile. But to do that, obviously they have to use evasive technology, very evasive techniques, because try a bunch of logins from one IP address, that's going to get caught right away. That's a basic thing you can set up on any Linux server. 3 strikes and you're out, right? So what they do is they rotate IP addresses, or they will rotate where they're coming from from different geos, because it's easy to block on geos. So I might say, oh, I'm going to block addresses from this country. Well, they can go through a proxy somewhere and do that. They can also then defeat challenges, because another technique is to say, okay, I think you might be an invalid user, so I'm going to present a challenge like a CAPTCHA, or they have to enter some other information. So I think those will become easier to defeat. But account takeovers is probably the most common one that we see out there. And again, we're beginning to see now the rise of the business logic attacks, like I mentioned earlier. That's more aligned with APIs. APIs have become really that new area where there's just so much focus from attackers, because that market has not matured yet. The belief was, oh, my API gateway is safe because I'm authenticating the user. Well, that's all fine, but how do you manage an invalid user? That stole some credentials or something else, and they're able then to get in and then have at it on your API backend. There's nothing looking at the actual data, for example, or how they're trying to manipulate the flows or the business logic within the application. So we're seeing a lot more of those types of attacks. Like I mentioned, about 70% of bad bot attacks were these API attacks. So against the business logic.
Yeah, I know Marco's probably jumping to get in, but I have one more point on this that I wanted to touch on. Is it's about the advanced piece, and more so the invasive nature of these things. Certainly not a lot of money to investment to get a bot running, and if there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, it doesn't have to be too advanced. It can be simple, right, to create a bot that does something for you, especially if it's very targeted. There's a weakness there that you can exploit. As the surface becomes more complex, certainly there's more complex, and as the logic is more complex, and perhaps even some of the general protections that are in place become a bit better, they have to become more advanced in how they conduct their activities. But then there's this idea of being evasive. So not just advanced in its ability to succeed, but it's also ability to remain undetected, right? So that don't know that actually something actually bad happened. So I don't know if I described any of that in a good way or not, but if you can kind of give us the description of those levels and what organizations need to think about with that in mind.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because these bot attacks, like I said, the sophistication is going up, and we see what we call a lot of these low and slow attacks. It's not like an attacker shows up and just throws the kitchen sink and everything at you. It's they tend to show up and they'll try one thing from one IP address. A little bit later, they'll try something else, and they'll just continue to do that kind of probing in a way that makes it very hard to detect. Unless you're actually keeping track of all these different login attempts and what the behaviors look like, and then be able to correlate, and then start to establish that there is an ongoing attack, that this is actually bots coming in and doing this. And that's why it's so important to think about having a bot protection solution, because it's what's delivering the attacker's intent. It's what's delivering the bad things. And so if you can eliminate that surface, you've taken out a big chunk, or you even mitigate it. You've taken out a big chunk of that toolkit that they go after you with. Now, of course, the key is you got to allow the good bots in, because like I said earlier, there's plenty of good bots. So you have to look for solutions that are able to reject with high fidelity, the attackers and the bad guys. But present low false positives, so that you're not blocking business. The big thing we always hear is don't stop my business. You know what I mean? That's not security, right? That becomes a brick, and I can't deal with that. So you have to ensure that business continuity goes on, and that's key for this. So low and slow is the most insidious. In fact, this you might find this interesting. One thing we started seeing was we'd start seeing these like DDoS attacks, like these network DDoS attacks. And then the IT teams would get fired up and be focused on that and reducing that. Well, behind the scenes, it was obscuring these bot level kind of bad bot attacks, these low and slow attacks kind of coming in around it, and they weren't paying attention to other events or alerts going on the back end because they had all this noise on the front end. And so that's why we also think that it's important to have a solution that's multi-layered. That is, that one that can reject those types of attacks, that can reject web app taps, other bot attacks, and present kind of that unified picture of what's going on. So you can capture this, because I also think that's going to be the future, is that you're going to get attacked on a number of fronts, but only one is really trying to go in and get your critical assets, your data or your finance, or money, if you will, or Bitcoin, whatever. That's the profile I think that we're going to continue to see more and more of as AI gets more sophisticated, for these attacks.
Well, you went there. You said future, you said AI, so I'm going for it.
All right.
When you were talking about the detection part and how sophisticated they are, and you mentioned CAPTCHA and whatever, and I'm thinking like, this is the same problem that we're having in detecting. This is something written by ChatGPT. Is it done by DALL-E or another online, Midjourney or whatever? I mean, how good is it going to get? And I'm wondering if, because I heard the story about this student making a paper that he was so good and creative that the teacher told, you must have done it with ChatGPT, because it was kind of too good, the assumption. So in a way, I'm thinking, do we need to start looking at fault into the humanity, because the bot is going to be so good that you're going to tell you're too good, you're too human, and you don't look, maybe you're not the human anymore. I mean, it's a big philosophical question here, and I want to touch that with where are we going with this, because I feel like it's not financial, the damage to the business. It's going to become much more than that. I mean, it could be still financial ultimately, but coming from copyright issue and branding proposition that are completely distorted. So truth, false. I'm a little bit concerned. I don't know about you.
I'm a lot concerned.
I mean, the simple use case of the false reviews driven by bots and things like that, right? I mean, it's just one, to your point on Marco, around branding and credibility and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's not just the stealing the credential. It's actually say, I'm going to damage you like at the base of your reputation. So I don't know, some thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, that is the typical DDoS type attack, right? It's to damage your reputation because it takes your service down in some fashion. Or ransomware is another kind of variant of that, right? They're basically holding your service hostage till either you cough up money or they have some other political or other motivation in the end that they want to have taken care of as a result of that. The way I tend to think of it with AI and ML is that, yes, you'll be able to much more easily emulate valid humans, right? So, and you're right that probably if things look too perfect, then that may be a flag. But in it itself won't be enough to make that kind of determination. That's what I was saying. You have to use other factors to validate and see, because it all becomes part of the toolkit. Behavioral mechanisms are just going to become less effective in that. You can't weight those as much. You have to look and find other ways to establish integrity of that. And the fact that AI will be so fast in how it learns and responds, that'll also be more difficult, because now hey, if I'm gonna get a botnet going, I'll get some feedback, I'll see what's happening. Maybe I put some instructions in there, but I don't know necessarily what's getting rejected, what's not. And it takes me time as the attacker to go and update the code, update the botnets and do that. Well, AI is going to do this in real time. It's going to be able to just quickly learn, figure out, hey, I'm going to map out this business logic in a say minutes versus days or weeks that it would take a typical hacker to go through and figure that out. So it's going to be more about kind of speed and being able to act quickly and use more of these immutable mechanisms to give me a sense of the integrity of that connection than trying to kind of ferret it out based upon what they're doing. So that's the way it has to go. And that's why I said you got to kind of go down stack and see what's actually happening under the hood more, or go and look at the client and see what they're doing. Identity will become another component of this as well, just making sure that there's high integrity in the but you're going to have to look in those 3 or 4 areas instead now where a lot of behavioral mechanisms are used, in different products.
And so kind of with I can't help now but look at the future to see where might we end up with this. But let's kind of look back 10 years to now as well, kind of the growth of automation and good versus bad. Where do we sit in terms of, I mean, how much human traffic to automated traffic was there early on 10 years ago compared to now, and how much is good versus bad early on compared to now? Because my sense is the automated is going to make it just the scale difficult to really get a handle on, and then the fact that there's so much bad, you're spending a lot of time finding bad that there might be something good there. You're, to your point earlier, you're blocking a lot of bad but also blocking a lot of good. So I don't any insights onto some of that change over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, this year alone, just in 1 year, we went up over 5% in the amount of traffic that was automated to almost 50%. It's like 47.4%. So it just continues to climb. I believe it was roughly half that 10 years ago in the percent of just bot traffic. So it just continues to climb. In a few years, it's probably going to get to 70, 80%. I mean, that's just the nature of it, because more and more automation is being leveraged, everything from mobile applications to these B2B apps to having highly distributed applications all over the place, to IoT. IoT is another great example. In fact, IoT is probably another good example of, things that can be used to create botnets, things like that, right? Because you'd see a lot of, for example, 10 years ago, one of the big exploits was hacking cameras, internet IP exposed cameras, things like that. And then it turned out those were actually a big source of botnet attacks at that time. Now it's all over the place, but I expect that to continue to grow. But it's been, right now it's about, like I said, roughly half the traffic. And of that traffic, 30% of that are bad bots. So, so that's, so we're talking, 15% roughly of all traffic on the internet is bad stuff. That's a lot of bad traffic out there, isn't it?
Wow.
And so, yeah, exactly.
Is there an impact on bandwidth and throughput? I mean, because that's a lot of just garbage on the internet. I don't know how much of that actually then enters into a business as bad, that kind of slows other processes down. I don't know if that's part of the report or not. Sorry for not knowing, but any insight on that?
Yeah, I mean, bot traffic in general is more transactional. Aside from like a DDoS attack, that's typically more of that volumetric style. I'm just going to throw a bunch of network things at somebody's website or their network, whereas the sophisticated attacks tend to be pretty low bandwidth because all they're doing is trying to get into that application. So it's just
not a lot of pipe filling with these.
No, yeah. You don't need to. In fact, that's one of the reasons they moved that sophistication, is that you can have a much smaller botnet. You don't need to have these massive volumes of stuff being tossed at front ends, if you will.
Which then makes it more difficult to detect because it's not filling up your pipe and slowing stuff down either.
Yeah, you can't just look at a threshold and say, "Oops, there we go." So you can't do that.
It's kind of like what you were saying, is eventually if there is the noise is the distraction, and then the real attack it's goes more undetected. So it's make me think about strategic war war strategies here, like, make some smoke there, but then we do the attack on the other side. But it also makes me think, maybe we start closing with this, the fact that there was the number about the advanced attack classified as advanced. And I remember one of the past year that we were doing the reports, we went through the whole classification of, what's bad, what's worst, what's even worse, and so forth. And now it seems like the advanced one are the one that are prevalent. I was looking at 51%, more than the year before, classified as advanced. And I cannot not think about this is due to, again, machine learning and AI, where everybody can just go and say, hey, write me a code for something really effective. So everybody could be potentially just become a bad guy.
Yep, certainly. Yeah, we saw it double last year. Basically, it went from 25% of bad bots to over 51%. So yeah, AI for sure is playing a role in that. Also, just the availability of the toolkits, the hacker toolkits out there, and those are become more freely available. And then also the fact that I think that the targets over APIs and is necessitated more of these sophisticated attacks. Plus, just the general bot solutions such as ours has just gotten so much better in the last few years in terms of their ability to defend against these attacks. So they have to move up in order to get that pay dirt, if you will. But yeah, and I expect this. I bet you next year the percentage will be 75% probably. That would be my guess right now. Just because I think everything has to move in that direction. It'll get a lot easier to do that.
Yeah, and I was looking at the report. It looks like the top two countries are America and Australia, which shows me that, well, they're both English speaking. So I don't know what if you have any sense of what makes them targets. Is it that there's just a lot of innovation there, or that they are English speaking, and do the bots care about the spoken language of the people that it's targeting? Does that matter?
No, I think it has to do probably with the openness, first of all. For example, US, open country, biggest economy in the world. So that shouldn't be a surprise. And we're probably the biggest online presence in the world, if you think about it, right? Every bank, Australia obviously is a bit smaller, but they also tend to be, at least my experience is, they tend to be very forward-looking on adoption of internet technologies and all that. Some of our biggest customers for Imperva are down there, and they're definitely ahead of the curve. We have a very large bank we work with down there, and some others. And I've worked with many in my previous lives. So I think it's just more about online presence, sophistication, openness of the country. I don't think it matters. Languages or cultures or things like that. It's more tech presence and the ability for hackers to find kind of a fertile ground to go after.
I don't know if it's possible or not, but I mean, we've talked a bit about the impact it can have. We didn't talk specifically numbers of how much these things cost yet, but clearly there's a need to mitigate this stuff, right? And obviously you have customers, so they trust you to help mitigate this risk and protect their apps from these bots. Any stories you can share where organizations saw a large bot attack that could have taken them down or cost them a huge amount of money, or just simply overwhelmed their team to where they couldn't deal with other things, kind of the deal with the noise, and the business falls apart as you're doing that? Any stories you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I can't talk about specific customers. There's a few. I mean, where we see some of the biggest, large scale attacks has been travel industry, like booking airline reservations and things like that. And, that's actually a big vertical for us, but that's where we see some of the biggest kind of web scraping attacks. And I was kind of surprised to see the volume or the amount or the ingenuity of those attackers to the point where if we're not protecting, they go into paralysis because they just get such a volume of traffic because everything's hitting their APIs. It actually gets expensive for them. They actually lose money because they're having to pay so much because, hey, API gateways charge usually by transaction or there's other things. You're moving a lot of data around on the back ends. It actually costs them quite a bit of money not to have a solution there to reduce that traffic. So it's not always just the data and protecting the assets, but it was literally hundreds of thousands of dollars that they were spending, to deal with this additional volume of traffic that they didn't want to deal with. So that's one example of one that we've seen. There's others where basically it was a large company. It was funny. They're very happy with us. We're protecting one of their other sites, and then they came under attack on an unprotected site, and it was just raising hell with the system. And it was kind of funny because the CISO that ran it, he said that without getting into specifics, they had released a new product, and it was one of the biggest product offerings ever. And for them, they hadn't done it in years. And what normally had happened in the past, they're worried about web scrapers these Grinch bot types getting on buying a bunch of this. And so they're very concerned about that. We're protecting that. And what happened was at the end of it, he said that we were so effective. He had something happen that had never happened before. He actually got complimented on how good the infrastructure handled this. And it was funny because then a few days later, then they came under attack to an unprotected site. They called us. We sat up in front of it. We took that down. But it was the first time actually, he said that he's ever been, they had somebody actually compliment him on something. So I thought, good. That's something to put in a check. Hey, security, we actually made a CISO happy. He got a compliment. That was a new one for me.
Yeah, usually when people are happy, do not necessarily write reviews, right? But when they are pissed, that's when you get a lot of it. So a CISO that get compliments, that goes in the book.
Yeah, sure. I figure they're going to be a customer for a while. So
there you go. Well, you said the magic word for me, and that's infrastructure, and don't need to look 10 years back necessarily to talk about this. I'm more interested in the now. Because the problem has grown so much, and the sophistication and advancement of the bad technologies have flourished. How does I guess the company's infrastructures have changed dramatically as well. So how does Imperva now keep up with and fit into the modern environments that are multi-hybrid cloud with containers and Kubernetes and apps everywhere and open source and shared this and API'd that, and you get the picture. It's how does Imperva fit into an organization now where a team can actually manage it, and perhaps you help them with that as well to stay ahead of this?
Yeah, I mean, the way we're focusing is that we want to protect apps regardless of where they're running, which means apps, and to do that means we have to be able to provide protections, whether they're public-facing apps, they're private apps, they're running their own infrastructure, they're running in cloud infrastructure. It doesn't matter to us. We want to make sure that we can apply our protections in a lightweight, easy way to consume. So customers can buy our SaaS offerings, or they can buy what we call our anywhere offerings. They're all centrally managed and can be deployed in a way that, hey, I just want to use your service. So for example, I got a web app. It's a public-facing web app. I'm just going to let you front end it with your web service. Well, then maybe later that same customer comes back and says, I have these APIs. Some are public, some are private. So what I'd like to be able to do is defend the public ones, but I also need the same security policies to defend the private ones because, yes, maybe I don't expose them to the internet, but they still get access and they're still being transacted, and we want to apply protections to these in the same way. So our view is let's have one set of policies and multiple ways to allow customers to leverage that. And so that's kind of the key. That's one key aspect of it. The other is that they have to fit within these frameworks, right? That is, if you're running like a cloud native basically, or if you're running an application that's built on a cloud native technology, let's say Kubernetes, to apply protections, you can't have some big heavyweight thing sitting in there. It actually has to operate seamlessly with that microservices environment. So it has to plug in nicely to that. And so that's the other aspect of it, is that it's lightweight and easy to fit with how these highly distributed apps, wherever they're going. And then finally, you have to have that intelligence to block these types of types of malicious behaviors. And so, we have a variety of mechanisms, everything from machine learning, but also we have a dedicated threat research team. And what they do is they're looking everywhere. They use various mechanisms to detect everything from honeypots to different ways to interrogate and look for malicious behaviors. We look across our existing, we have thousands of customers, and we see all the transaction histories across that, meaning that we see all the events and what's happening, and we're able to see attacks as they evolve in many cases. In fact, the log4shell attack that happened, we actually saw it developing about a week beforehand. We started seeing this kind of pop up, and once we were able to get a insight on what's going on, we had it blocked immediately. So all customers, by the time it got announced about a week later, we had been protecting our customers for days. We see we get that kind of visibility. So we have to continue with that. We have to always be out there. We're trying to be again, like I said, it's an arms race, and we have to stay in front of it. And as we go on, AI and machine learning, which we already leverage, is going to become a much bigger component of that, because it's not just about using the automation it provides. I think of it as the force multiplication it provides, the ability to assist our threat research team in their mission and being able to ferret things out quicker and much with these more sophisticated attacks. That's where I think the real value is for us as a security company.
Nice. And are there cases? I would imagine if a bot's extremely successful, and it has a significant impact on some operation that ends up impacting financial results, it's pretty obvious, right? And you probably get that call. Are there less obvious scenarios where the bots are running under the radar and scraping little bits here and there, so you don't really see the big impact, but there is an impact? And if so, how do you work with companies to kind of uncover that, to let them know that they have a problem that they didn't even realize?
Yeah, I mean, one of the key mechanisms for us is to show them the problem, and we do that through a variety of mechanisms. But one of the big ones is that if they're already running on our service, it's very easy for us to say, well, do you know what do you know how many APIs you're using? Do you know what the endpoints look like? For example, we can do that discovery process and then show that to them. We offer what we call attack analytics, and so that shows kind of these different categories of attacks or threats that they're experiencing. Same thing with like bots. The problem is, like you said, most out there actually don't realize they have a bot problem. It's actually happening all the time, and they don't realize these things are just ongoing on their sites. And so, it's not until, like you said, that something actually gets breached or some bad thing happens that they're necessarily cognizant of that. It could be ransomware, it could be whatever. And so, we try to show them, hey, look, we saw these account takeover attempts. So you might want to do something about that, right? This is not a good thing.
Some percentage of that 15% of bad
exactly
is going their way, even if it's not all 15%. Some of it is.
Yeah. I'll tell you right now, if you got a website, you got bad bot activity on it, no matter who you are. It's just out there, and it's just a matter of time that they're going to find something, or you're a big enough target, and it'll just happen. But it's out there everywhere. Just given that number, I still remember. This goes back 8 years, 9 years. This is my home network. I opened up. I was doing some backups between systems, and you have to open up port 22, which is SSH, right? So I'm on an ephemeral IP address on my home router, and within an hour, I had 4 different attacks where they came in and tried to do account takeover, basically just throwing basically default passwords and things like that at it. But that was on ephemeral IP addresses, or excuse me, ephemeral ports, if you will, on ephemeral IP addresses on a home network. That's and that was 8 or 9 years ago. So what that meant is that there was just bots out there trolling just to see if that port was open, port 22. So now we're 8 years later, a much bigger network, much more sophisticated bots. You can only imagine what that looks like. It's just everywhere, pervasive all the time.
Pervasive. I think that's the That's the takeaway word today.
The operating or pervasiveness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which means you need to be persistent in how you deal with it. Well, Karl, I mean, this has been a fantastic chat, a nice look back. Maybe not the best uplifting subject until we talk about the fact that you can protect yourself against this, protect the business from it. But interesting to take a look back to see how we've progressed over the years, both in the operating environment and in the attack space. Any final thoughts before we wrap here?
Yeah, no, just to reiterate, like I said, I think pervasiveness is the key thing, and that it's out there. People don't see it until something bad happens, and you want to stay in front of this, and the opportunity for bad things to happen is just going to increase, I think. So I know it's not the most uplifting message, like you said, but there are companies like us that help and manage that, and like I said, that's all we focus on. That's we're not trying to be beyond that. That's security is our thing, and it's something we spent 20 years hopefully getting right.
And we barely scratched the surface in the bad bot report. I mean, there's so much information in there. I mean, it's probably the same message at the end of each of these conversations we've had over the last few years. There's so much pertinent info there that your organization can glean and help you define where you should focus based on your size and your industry and the environment that you're running in and blah, 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 all these factors. And thankfully, Karl and team at Imperva have your back here. So we'll include links to the bad bot reports and to the bad bot protection solution and services, so folks can look at all of those things. Of course, Karl's profile will be in the notes as well. So if you have a question specific that Karl can answer, not me, you'll be able to contact him there as well. Good stuff, Marco. I mean, we started with ghosts. No ghost here, just 15% bad bots. And
there's still ghosts.
There are ghosts.
They're all in the machine. So, and that was my, drum roll at the end.
That's right. All right.
Well, thank you, Karl. Very interesting conversation. Really appreciate it, and always appreciate Imperva to join us for this fantastic conversation that we hope are very educational for our audience, and certainly was for me.
Yep, an annual tradition. So thanks everybody for listening. Check out Imperva. Stay tuned for more conversations. There's a lot going on, and we love the team there. So thanks everybody. Talk to you soon.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you learned something new and this story made you think, then share ITSPmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.